and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, North America's leading provider of employee communication resources, including video, websites, e-learning, social media, and virtual events to help you connect with your team. For more information, you can visit us online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. Now, it wasn't all that long ago that the idea of expanding workplace wellness to go beyond simple physical health and include mental health was considered a progressive move. Today, after weathering what we hope is the worst of the pandemic, our understanding of mental wellness and its impact on the workplace has never been clearer. The mental health of your workforce is just as important as their physical health, and in times like these, businesses need a healthy and resilient workforce to succeed. Today, we're joined by Kathryn Mayer, Human Resource Executive's Benefits Editor and Chair of the Health and Benefits Leadership Conference. In her role at HR Executive, Kathryn has covered benefits for the better part of a decade. She's won multiple awards for her work in this area, and last year, for World Mental Health Day, she published a collection of 15 of her must-read stories about mental health for HR executives. Kathryn, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So clearly, this past year had to be a busy one for you. As Benefits Editor of Human Resources Executive, with so many looking to you for guidance on supporting employees during such challenging times, what were the biggest takeaways for you from this experience?
Yeah, it's certainly been a very busy year, but
Sure.
it's exciting to think that your work matters and it can provide a value to employers and then in effect with that, millions of employees who belong to those organizations. I think it goes to show how important it is to cover what employers do and what their strategies are, especially during a time like this. Employers can learn a lot from each other on COVID response and what's working and what's not. Largely, employers were not prepared for this, but it
Sure.
did speed up a lot of innovation that I think ultimately needed to happen. We're talking embracing remote work or pushing out tailored benefits, or of course, a focus on mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and just really being there for employees during times of turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really been a fascinating thing to cover. And, like many others, it's obviously been a challenging year for me personally, of course, that goes without
Sure.
saying. But professionally, it's actually been really rewarding. Covering this has been just really fascinating. And it feels like meaningful work.
So where do you think we are now? How's our current collective mental state?
Yeah, putting it bluntly, it's not good. We've had this year where it's just been stressful event after stressful event, and it's incredibly hard to keep up. Our emotional tank is essentially running on empty.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been lots of surveys and research about how COVID-19 has dramatically taken a toll on mental health. Rates of depression, anxiety, stress, burnout, they're all up right now.
Mm-hmm.
And COVID's really this unique event where it's affecting people in one way or another. So a lot of us are working from home. We're scared to get sick. We're scared of seeing people we love getting sick or even
Mm-hmm.
dying.
Mm-hmm.
There's childcare issues. There's this whole new virtual learning component. There's
Mm-hmm.
financial ramifications of this. And on top of all this, too, there's loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially for the people who are doing what they should be doing and what health officials recommend in terms of, not really seeing people outside of your household or
Mm-hmm.
not going to these public places and not having maskless get-togethers, it's incredibly hard and isolating. So everyone has really had one or more of these experiences. And then you add on social unrest, racial unrest, a contentious presidential election, the
Mm-hmm.
Capitol riots, which
Mm-hmm.
occurred earlier this month, which were disturbing to see.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, it's really the most problematic time for our collective mental health.
Yeah. So COVID-19 exposed many weaknesses, and you mentioned that. How has it exposed weaknesses within organizations with regard to wellness and mental health?
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I'm glad you bring this up because it's definitely one of the most interesting things that I think that we've learned from this COVID experience is just all these shortcomings that it exposed in the workplace. So I wrote an article pretty early on in the pandemic. I think it was May about these shortcomings. And I looked at if COVID will essentially make employers fix their mental health problem.
Mm.
And when I say mental health problem, essentially I'm saying that many of the employers did not have the right benefits or the programs and also the culture in place to adequately address these mental health concerns even before COVID happened. And of course, things got so much worse with COVID
Right.
entering our lives.
Hmm.
So, and the shortcomings basically run the gamut. So, there was a lack of resources that were offered. There was lackluster communication about existing offerings. And then there was this kind of near unanimous view that the subject was simply too taboo for the workplace.
Mm,
So it just wasn't necessarily being addressed properly.
sure. So there was a quote in that article that really hit home for me. That it said, "In our current circumstances, we realize that the stuff that maybe used to be viewed as extra or nice to have, like mental health, is absolutely necessary and foundational. That simply put, mental health and our fundamental human needs are no longer aspects of work that can be deprioritized." Do you believe that mental health has been deprioritized in the past? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I absolutely do. It's historically been deprioritized both in the workplace and also just in our normal lives. I think only recently have people been more aware of making sure they felt emotionally well and tried to take care of themselves in that way. And the workplace definitely has been slow to catch on. You think, about as humans, as Americans especially, we value working hard to the point of exhaustion.
Yeah.
We reward starting early and working late. We get accolades for burning the midnight oil. We don't
Hmm.
get accolades for, hey, I need to take a break or I'm really stressed out right now.
Hmm.
So, and important to note too is that it just hasn't been okay, I think, to talk about in the workplace. We historically think of work as this professional environment. We don't always talk about our personal issues, our feelings, our health. It just wasn't common to discuss or prioritize as much. So, overall, there has been this kind of shift in the last couple years where wellness went from just physical health to this overall holistic health. And that did
Hmm.
include emotional and mental well being. So it has been talked about in recent years, but I would not say it's been really prioritized by most employers.
Well, hopefully, we'll see that change. All right,
Yeah.
Catherine, we're going to take a sponsorship break right now, but when we return, we're going to look into how companies have been responding to these shortcomings, as well as ways that you, as an HR professional, can help. So stay with us.
Thanks to the Respectful Workplace for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Brand new for 2020, the Respectful Workplace is online harassment prevention that connects with your workforce so you can focus on growth and success. Download our free state-by-state guide to harassment prevention at therespectfulworkplace.net and get started today.
We're back with Kathryn Mayer, Benefits Editor for Human Resource Executive. Kathryn, how have companies been responding to meet this shortcoming in the wake of the pandemic?
Overall, a number of employers have stepped up. They have reevaluated offerings and they did roll out some new ones, whether those are specific mental health offerings or even other benefits like caregiving or
Hmm.
financial health programs or childcare solutions, which also take a direct aim at some of these employees' pain points and stressors. So that's always important as things crop up. You can't wait until the next year. That's not going to help anyone.
Hmm.
So responding fast and not waiting until a new plan year to make changes was certainly an important thing companies did. More have enhanced their EAPs. They, giving workers more counseling sessions, for example, and a lot more are partnering with apps or programs to help build resilience. And another cool thing to mention has been mental health days. So,
Hmm.
a couple companies, including Pinterest and Cisco, for example, they had extended the Memorial Day weekend for workers last year, telling them, take a breather, here's a mental health day.
Hmm.
And Thomson Reuters also said in the fall that it's instituting a mental health day as an annual company holiday,
Hmm.
which will be held every October. So I think those are a couple of cool examples to mention.
For sure. And I was struck specifically by Starbucks' response in April. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Starbucks has done a couple important things with mental health recently. In April, it started to provide all of its employees, as well as eligible family members, access to 20 sessions a year with a mental health therapist or coach
Wow.
through provider Lyra Health. And that's at no cost to the employee.
Hmm.
So that was great to begin with. And then in June, it also began doing some mental health training for some of its employees. So that
Hmm.
basically helps workers recognize and respond to signs of mental health or substance abuse issues, and then know how to provide the right resources or the right help for that. And then one more thing they did, actually, even before all that, in January, before the pandemic began, they had rolled out Headspace, which is that daily meditation and
Hmm.
mindfulness app,
Yeah.
as a benefit to employees. And they said that that has been extremely popular and helpful as its workers deal with some of those new stresses
Hmm.
from COVID. So, yeah, Starbucks is a great example of a company that really stepped up, I think, in this last
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, and I love that all of those elements together sort of make it a normal part of the conversation. It's not something that is shameful to talk about. Like you were saying, as Americans, we're taught to burn the candle at both ends, but this
Yeah.
kind of allows us that conversation to happen. So, as HR professionals, obviously, our audience wants to try and help people, and I
Mhm.
think we're tempted by the idea of quick fixes. So, what are your thoughts regarding things like stress management programs?
Yeah, I think it's good for sure, but I one thing to know is that you can't be one and done with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's best to have a few different things in place too, just to have a variety of support, kind of like Starbucks, like we were just talking about,
Mm-hmm.
because people like different things and they react to different things. So some may get a lot of value in programs and apps to manage stress, but others might not. So others might really benefit from therapy, for instance, or one on one counseling. People like to have different options in the same way that, an employer usually will provide a number of different health plans, medical plans that
Mm-hmm.
employees can choose from. So it depends on your circumstance. So if you're looking at health plans, for example, are you married? Do you have kids? Do you go to the doctor a lot? It's kind of similar when you think about mental health programs. Some just happen to fit, some better than others. And I will note though, at the same time, I think having any kind of offering, even if it is just one, any kind of specific program or help can really make a big difference for employees because it can make them feel good and it feels like they are supported by their employer.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and you talked a lot about circumstances just now, and a lot of us are trying to support remote workforces.
Uh-huh.
What are your thoughts on the use of apps like the Headspace app or other types of online support?
Yeah. My view on it is really why not?
Mm,
What's the harm of
right.
trying different
Sure.
kinds of offerings? And again, when it comes to apps and online support, they're fairly easy to implement and push out for organizations. So it doesn't take a lot of legwork or cause administrative headaches for the most part.
Hmm.
And as far as the employees, we're all in this virtual world right now. So there are types of things like Headspace, which employees can, they could log into, they can use when they need it or when they want it.
Hmm.
And there's a big convenience factor to it, which I think is nice. And, they don't have to schedule it like they might for like a therapy appointment or something like that. They can
Right.
just pull out their phone, use it when they want. And I think there's a lot of benefit to that.
So you mentioned a minute ago EAPs, employee
Yeah.
assistance programs. Not a lot of people use those benefits. Should we try and encourage use of those, or how can we if we want to point people in that direction?
Absolutely. I think a lot of it comes down to communication and communication problems. Because, think about the jobs that you've had and the benefits or plans that you've had. Did you always know what was included in your plan or what
Hmm.
your offerings were? That's the problem, is that benefits aren't a topic that employees really know everything about. Employers absolutely cannot assume that their workers know every one of their company's offerings, like the EAP. Just because it was in a handbook, maybe they saw once,
Mm,
or it came up during open enrollment at one point a year ago.
right.
There was research from Unum that had come out that said it was the vast majority, it was something like 93% of HR professionals say that they do offer an EAP, but about half of workers said that their employer does not offer an EAP. So
Hmm.
again, that just really goes to show how vital it is to have this constant communication and remind employees about this. So
Hmm.
again, right now, smart employers are constantly reminding employees about those mental health programs that they have available to them, including EAPs, and not just reminding them, but also encouraging them to use them.
So beyond the tech or the programs that we have in place, let's talk a little bit about what impact good leadership can have on a team. Like I'm talking about simple check-ins, asking people how they're doing, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because that's maybe one of the most important things company leaders can do right now is really be human in this moment and normalize these conversations and normalize the fact that what we're going through right now is not normal. So it really does help to hear someone say, it's okay not to be okay right now,
Mm.
especially if it comes from a leader in your company. That simple acknowledgement from your boss or a team leader or company leader can actually really help. So I've talked to a number of experts on this very subject, and they say that asking your employees, pretty regularly, how are you doing? But not just how are you doing, but how are you really doing? Or
Hmm.
simply acknowledging to your employees that this is a really hard time is very helpful. Or even to
Hmm.
say to them, I'm going through a hard time right now. I'm sure you are too. If you want to talk about this, I'm here. It really makes people feel less alone and it makes them feel validated in their feelings. And
Hmm.
it also makes them feel like their employer cares about them.
I think that's particularly true if you've got remote workers, working in isolation, like we've talked about. How
Yeah,
can leaders do a better job of checking in on mental health in that virtual setting? It's kind of a sticky thing to do.
it is. You know, that's one of the things is that this isolation that we're feeling is a problem. And because everyone is remote, there's that extra layer of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is that more leaders are kind of reaching out and having those communications and having that engagement with the remote workforce. And I think that's super important. And some of the things that I've written about that they're doing is just those little things. Like maybe they're doing a little coffee chat or they're doing a virtual happy hour or they're doing,
Hmm.
some more of those video calls. Even though I know a lot of us are kind of fatigued over our video calls, but at the same time, having that does help.
Yeah, I like that idea. The intentional. Let's actually talk about something other than work. Let's just get together and talk about how things are going. That's smart.
Yeah. So someone
Yeah.
had said to me not long ago that sometimes having kind of a personal conversation or even having like a little icebreaker starting or beginning a meeting with, hey, let's all talk about our favorite movie or give me a show to
Hmm.
binge watch or something. Like
Hmm.
that could actually help that loneliness.
Yeah, for sure. So, in that same Strategy 101 article that you wrote that I mentioned earlier, you
Yeah,
provided a list of some of the best ways to provide mental health support to employees. Can you share that list with us?
sure. Some of the strategies we've talked about a little bit so far, like evaluating and adding resources,
Hmm.
looking at apps for support, giving employees an extra day off for mental health,
Hmm.
and making sure that employees are aware of EAPs and other resources. Those are definitely on the list. I'll name a couple others that are worth mentioning that we didn't go over. One of the best things to do initially is to survey employees. So, really find out what they're feeling, what their stresses are, and find out how you might be able to help them. Because that gives you a chance to get a pulse of your workforce
Hmm.
and see if they have ideas on, what kind of specific help would they like, for instance. And then actually on that same note, we were just talking about remote work, create clear boundaries between work and personal time in remote settings. So being flexible about employees' schedules in the new environment and encouraging them to take time for themselves or their families. That's actually an
Hmm.
important strategy for mental health and that can help. And again, finding ways to connect with employees because of that social distancing and remote work, there are those feelings of loneliness and
Hmm.
isolation. So that's kind of stuff are all can help and are all included on that list.
Yeah, those are all great ideas. Catherine, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is Kathryn Mayer, Benefits Editor for Human Resource Executive. We're back. How important is it, Kathryn, for employers to communicate with employees about mental health and the benefits they provide? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I want to dig in a little bit on what that communication might look like and what you've seen companies do that really works.
Yeah, it's so important because not everyone is going to remember what they have in terms of offerings or even know how they work or know how to access them. So I
Mm,
think in those materials, say if you're sending emails regularly, and that's always good. Again, in between, I think you should do a variety of different communications. You should do some emails, you should do some home mailings. So then, the family members could see it as well. But you should include phone numbers, include websites, any of the information that can quickly help them access those benefits. That is important to include. And employees often need a lot of different touches to catch their attention. I
hmm
think that's something important to note.
hmm
And they need to get that information at the right moment when they need it and when they need that help. So it's important to keep those reminders coming
mm
because you might really help someone when you do send out that second email of the week.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the projections we do video, we do websites, we do e-learning, and so we subscribe to that same philosophy that you need to put out a video in order to present the topic. Then you need to have a website available so that they can go back, like you're saying, when they need it. So,
Exactly.
so do you feel like leadership, both HR and regular leadership, do they communicate well when it comes to mental health?
Historically, no. And it's because it was hands off for a lot of companies. I think that's one reason. It was hands off for organizations and for a lot of leaders. And I don't think that's necessarily their fault. It's just historically how the workplace has been. But what COVID is teaching us is that we're putting the human back into the workplace and the human back into human resources, especially because during this, you absolutely have to. They need to get involved with this, they need to communicate with mental health.
Mm.
And you need your employees to be mentally well because that helps your workforce, of course, and it also affects your workplace and it affects the company.
Oftentimes it goes the other way too. Employees don't feel comfortable speaking openly about mental health issues. Some have even experienced negative consequences. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, you're right. It's it's emotional, it's personal. You're lucky if you have a boss who you feel open enough with to
hmm
say, "Hey, here's what I'm going through at home or what I'm going through health-wise or this COVID isolation, it's really getting to me." But most don't have that. And there was research from Paychecks that had come out recently that found that 30% of employees feared that discussing their mental health could lead to being fired or furloughed.
Yeah.
And the same amount essentially had thought that discussing their issues could cost them a promotion.
Mm.
So not only are we seeing employees be increasingly worse off during the pandemic, but
hmm
they're actually scared that they'll be fired if they
hmm
mention this growing stress. So
Yeah.
obviously that's really problematic.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a tough place to be in when you're actually going through it. So once the pandemic recedes, the mental health issues that brought it about, they're really just not going to disappear. So how do you think we can continue to support our teams and help them become more resilient after this is behind us?
It's important to be reminded of how bad our mental health is right now. And the way it's going, it's actually on track to become its own pandemic in the years to come.
Mm.
It's important to realize that mental health issues, they don't just turn off. They won't go away with the snap of a finger or even with the end of the pandemic.
hmm
It's great to think that our collective mental health will go back to normal when life gets back to normal, but life isn't normal. It's not predictable. We all have
hmm
personal battles that we go through. We lose loved ones and we have personal health battles. We have hard times at work. So, how we're thinking about mental health during COVID is so important, but it shouldn't be our emergency procedure. This should really be the standard operating procedure that
Mm.
employers have. I think the more that we can build the skills in employees and how they deal with depression, anxiety, stress, burnout, all these important issues, the happier workforce you're going to have and the more productive workforce you are going to have. So it will be better off for employers. It's just, this is prioritizing employee mental health. It needs to be our new normal, and we really just can't get complacent about it.
Absolutely. And I think employers need to recognize that there are definite positives to making sure that this is at the forefront of what we're talking about. So I want to go back to your must-read series, the collection of
Mhm.
stories that you put together for World Mental Health Day. It was such a good go-to for catching up on the topic. Were these stories all written during 2020?
Yeah, and it's certainly, like I said, it's been such a busy year, especially for mental health. There's just been so many stories to write about it. I think overall, I've written at least a couple hundred articles over just this past year alone. So
Wow.
it's been a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, all this amazing content was published by Human Resource Executive. I have no doubt that our listeners are quite well acquainted with the publication and its online presence. But can you tell us a little bit more about HR Executive for those folks that might not be in the know?
Of course. Thanks. HR Executive is a publication for HR leaders and executives, as says in the name. We offer insights from a number of leaders themselves and provide a lot of in-depth articles and breaking news, everything in between. So we publish new content every day online at our website, hrexecutive.com, and we have a print magazine as well and a variety of new e-newsletters. We also provide those. So you can subscribe to any of those and get news delivered to your inbox.
Yeah, I
So
get several of those myself. They're
great.
excellent. They're excellent. So, how can our listeners find out a little bit more about you and your work at HR Executive?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn and you can follow me on Twitter at Mayer Editor. And obviously come and find my articles on
For sure.
hrexecutive.com.
Yep.
If you click on my byline in any of those articles, a full list of my stories pop up. So
Oh, nice.
just you can have plenty to read.
Okay. All right. And I want to let our listeners know that a link to Kathryn's collection of 15 must-read stories about mental health for HR executives will be included in this episode's companion guide, along with links to HR Executive. So be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Kathryn, it is time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Okay, yeah.
All right. So our first question is a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about the value and importance of employee resilience, especially in times like these. In your opinion, which of these animals is the most resilient, the common cockroach or cartoon icon Wile E. Coyote?
Now we're getting to the real hard-hitting questions. I like it.
Sure.
I've got to go Wile E. Coyote because he fails wildly every time he tries to get the Roadrunner, but yet he keeps going back for more. So
There you go.
you've got to give him some credit for that.
I like it. Excellent. So tell me, what is the best book that you've read recently?
My favorite book that I've read recently has got to be Alex Trebek's autobiography, which is called The Answer Is. I'm a huge Jeopardy fan, a huge Alex Trebek fan. And talk about resilience. Here's a guy who went through this horrible cancer diagnosis and treatment.
Yep.
And of course, he unfortunately just passed away from that disease.
Right.
But he was working a job he loved up until his death. And in his book, he's just full of gratitude despite what he's going through. And he just talks about how he's trying to make a difference in people's life. It's just a really beautiful story.
That sounds fantastic. I'm going to have to get that.
Yeah.
So tell me, what's your favorite thing about working at Human Resource Executive?
Telling stories that matter. I think that's definitely my favorite thing. You don't think of business reporting or HR or employee benefits necessarily as sexy topics, but it's meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
I can write about what employers are getting right or getting wrong and, give strategies that can affect the way big employers handle things like COVID, for example, and maybe in effect change the way millions of people work or get help from their employer.
Yeah, love that. We experience that as well. I love hearing, being able to share stories between employers and letting people know what other companies are doing.
Exactly.
So on that note, what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Boy, my parents always told me to be your own advocate. You're the one who needs to come to bat for yourself. And especially for women, I think that we have a harder time doing that sometimes. You know, women, of course, historically get paid less, or they're not taken as seriously at work. And they don't even get believed at the doctor a lot more often. You know, there's all kinds of research that a lot of times they have to go to multiple appointments, multiple doctors to get help. So I think for women especially, that advice is especially important.
Be your own best advocate. I like that. Yeah. So who or what inspires you?
You know, of course, I think about my family. I have wonderful parents, a great husband. You know, all of that always inspires me. Sure. I have to say I have a 95-year-old grandmother, and she is someone who's just really great about gratitude and positivity. Like so many other people, she's gone through a number of trials in her life, but I talk to her all the time, and she always says pretty much every day how lucky she is and how blessed she is. And just that gratitude and that positivity, especially when we talk about resilience and everything, I think it's just such a great outlook. And it's one that I self-admittedly don't always have, but I sure try to.
She sounds like a great example of resilience.
Exactly.
So, Kathryn, I want to thank you for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a blast.
So thanks to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, please feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. And last but certainly not least, make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR. I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply rate us 5 stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.